Hi, everybody. Hello and welcome to Book Passage Online, where we are delighted to present another in our continuing series of conversations with authors. Today, we are delighted to present author Scott Badler, who is here to talk about JFK and the Muckers of Choate, a self-described real-to-life novel that explores a little-known chapter in the life of President John F. Kennedy as a student in his prep school days. Scott will be joined in conversation by Bruce Yalaska. My name is Jonathan Spencer, and I am the assistant manager at Book Passage and your host for today's event. Thank you so much for your patience while we dealt with some technical difficulties. I would like to extend thanks to you on behalf of Scott, Bruce, and all of us at Book Passage for taking the time to be with us. As we are recording this, the holiday season is in full swing. The winter light is beginning to make itself felt, and nothing to my mind makes this time of year more cozy and rewarding than finding a great novel to dive into. And you can give that gift to yourself anytime. We host a robust selection of in-person and online events at Book Passage throughout the year, so please do yourself a favor and pay a visit to our website to see what's coming up on our event calendar both this month and in the coming new year. Speaking of great novels, early peer reviews have called JFK and the Muckers of Choate fascinating, an enjoyable romp, and a fast, fun read. Scott Badler's strength is in revealing how Kennedy developed empathy for the poor and disenfranchised while leading fellow students in fun-filled pranks and desired school reforms, experiencing his first sexual escapade, and interacting with his famous family. Leavened with just the right amounts of humor and historical foreshadowing, it is hard to put down. Scott Badler has been a newspaper reporter and a regular contributor to such publications as the Boston Globe, where many of his humor pieces have appeared. In addition, he has written two nonfiction books, What's So Funny About Looking for a Job? And Oh Brother and Other Revelations on Family, Relatives, Pets, and Sex. He has taught humor writing courses at Harvard and Emerson College. A native Californian, he was born in LA but lived in the greater Boston area for many years, some of them in the district where JFK won his first congressional seat in 1946. This will be his first novel. Joining Scott in conversation is Bruce Yalaska. Bruce is a designer, teacher, and improviser living and working in San Francisco. He has won numerous design awards and has been featured in publications such as Print, Communication Arts, and Graphis. As an educator, he has taught design and art to students spanning the grades from kindergarten to the university level at UC Berkeley Extension. As an improviser, he has performed on stages in San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, and any place where people like to laugh. And though we are gathered virtually, we will be happy to take some of your questions toward the end of our time together today. Just type your questions into the chat, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, as we get ready to start here, let us welcome Scott and Bruce.
I mean, he really was in terrible shape as a young man and a boy at Choate, and yet still managed to have a personality that people recognize, and and made a presence for himself. But he spent a lot of time out of school in infirmament in hospitals, long periods like that.
The Mayo Clinic, several times, and a lot of his problem was just colitis, or we call irritable bowel syndrome, but they didn't know what to do with it then. So he just had an incredible amount of procedures and enemas, and he was really tortured by it. But he had other things too. He would get hives and headaches and migraines and fever. So he was really, I think he was very easy to get infections and everything. And of course, he had incredible back problems throughout his life. Um, and that probably started a little bit after Choate, but
Mhm.
all through his life, he looks like the picture of health as president, but he was taking a lot of drugs then. So, health was a problem, and I give him all the credit for persevering through his life, through these health problems, because he had them throughout his life.
Yeah. So in that show, he never, even though he was ill, did students think of him as a sickly person, or did they think did that not register with the other students? Because I mean, being a boarding school, you're pretty aware when somebody's not around, I think. Yeah.
I think, it was a fairly big school, so people in his class were certainly aware. He'd be in the infirmary. He was, very big into sports, very excited about playing sports, as most boys are. He played first year football, played some basketball. By his last year, the administration, in collusion with his father, said no more sports. He can't play sports anymore, just because of the health risk. So it was kind of a
Mhm.
sad times last year. It's graduation, dances, and he wasn't able to play sports, and that was, that's kind of hurtful.
Right. What kind of athlete was he? Was he the star quarter? I know his brother was an amazing athlete, but that was another thing with his sports.
Yeah, his brother was a lineman who played on the championship undefeated team. He wasn't a
Hmm.
great JFK, and it sort of reminds me of my situation. There's different parallels you make. I wasn't good in tackle football, but in touch football, I was quick and elusive, and that's what JFK was. I mean, he was incredibly skinny. He's always That's one thing about his health. He was always losing weight, and he gained it back on, but he was always losing weight. So he really couldn't compete on football. But he went out for football at Harvard, and he played a couple of years on the freshman team and then junior varsity, and that was as far as he could kind of go, just because he wasn't sort of big enough and strong enough. But he was a decent tennis player. So he was a good athlete, definitely a good athlete.
Well, it's a lot of times you make friendships through sports and other things, and of course at a school you make friendships through other ways. But did he have a lot of friends at Choate? Was he the popular guy? Did he have close relationships?
Starting in the last year, he was starting. People were sort of a Pied Piper, and they were other kids were following him around. Involved with his little mischief and everything. So he became, kind of popular, kind of popular. He had a certain charisma even back then, joking around. It was always a good time to be around Kennedy,
Uh-huh,
and,
uh-huh.
and kind of early, sort of his last year or so at Choate. And, of course, his best friend, which is an interesting relationship, was with Lem Billings, who was his roommate at Choate for his last year and a half, and was his friend for life. Even had a room in the White House. So that was always an
Yeah.
interesting relationship. Um, Lem sort of was devoted to Kennedy and would just, I won't say a lemming, but he would follow Kennedy wherever he would go. But he was his closest friend, where he didn't have to. There was no judgment from Lem, and he was friends with him, throughout life. And the interesting about Lem, of course, he was gay, and not that it ever came out. He never came out in those days. It was illegal, and it never certainly anything was happened at Choate. But there was a certain thing that happened, as I talk about in the book. It's pretty interesting. Is that JFK was in Mayo Clinic, the summer of '34, and he sort of complained. He liked to write incredibly. That's one thing I learned about Kennedy, how profane he was. So he liked to write these incredibly profane letters to Lem, sort of titillating, about talking about, becoming aroused, and they gave him an enema and everything. And Lem read it as, that he wanted to provide some sort of pleasure for Kennedy when he came back to school. And he wrote a letter to JFK offering him, some sort of sexual satisfaction. And, it didn't necessarily mean that Lem was gay, because, it was an all boys school, and, boys experimented at that age. But, JFK said, I'm not that kind of boy, and put an end to that. But a lot of people would sort of say, well, I don't want to be involved with someone like that, but they continued to be friends for, the rest of their life.
Well, and as you said, he became a confidant. So, it's maybe the fact that JFK was able to keep this secret that Lem could never let out in life, especially during that generation. And maybe having somebody that you could trust that much is an important thing through life. You experience things together. In school, as you said, Lem was one of the. How many people were in the Muckers? You were saying there were a group of friends in the Muckers. I'm assuming Lem was one of them.
Yeah, certainly. It's about 11, yeah.
And you said they did pranks. Can you give us an idea of some of the pranks they did, or something that in particular?
It was sort of an attitude. They formed this thing, and there was rumors, and I don't think it's true, that they blew up a toilet. Investigation reveals that they really didn't do that. So he would just create this sort of attitude of being late for class, of giving back talk to teachers. And at a school like Choate, you don't do anything like that. So there was something that they were, that they were kidding about. They'd have these meetings in JFK's room and play records and dance. And they'd throw up ideas about things they should do. So they were going to do something. They weren't going to do it. They brought up the idea of bringing a lot of horse muck into the dance, to the big dance. And someone tattled or said, and it got back to the headmaster. Now, they were never going to do it, but it got, and the headmaster said, we can't have this. And in the middle of a meal, he said, I want, called all their names and have them, came into the his office, and he expelled them.
Oh, wow.
The next train home, there's one leaving in the afternoon. I suggest you be on it. And some things happened in between then. Some teachers said, intervened and whatever. And JFK got involved and formed alliances with some teachers. And so it was, the expulsion was rescinded. And who knows, if it got rescinded, maybe, he never would have become president or something like that. Could have happened.
Right. Yeah.
But something else that had a big effect on him was, I was really surprised to read that JFK being in therapy. This is 1935. I mean, Freud, psychotherapy has sort of just begun. And so after the expulsion was rescinded, the headmaster talked with, JFK's father, who had a big influence on him. And one of the others suggested him seeing a therapist at Columbia. I was surprised, why would JFK go? And I think, the reason I've come to is that he was just an incredibly curious person. And, someone says you should go to therapy, you say, oh, you're sick, right? I think he took it as, well, I'm curious, what is this psychotherapy? So he went twice, and it's interesting to look at the therapist's notes and just see what went on there. I think the biggest thing he discovered is that, he realized he wasn't putting forth his best effort because he couldn't compete with his brother Joe. So after therapy and thinking about it, the last final months of his school year, he says, I'm going to do my best. He pulled up his grades and sort of went on from there. That was his jumping off point, that last semester at Choate. He really, from there, things sort of took off in a slow way, slow progression. But I think that
Something that often would come up in therapy, of course, is association with your family. And we mentioned his brother, who obviously there was a lot of competition there. His father was a dominant force in his life as well. It seems, especially he felt like his father favored his older brother Joe, but he comes from obviously a large family. What was his relationship, even though he was away at times and he had breaks, of course, from this period, and summer, winter breaks, things like that. And he had other siblings, he had sisters and brothers, and he was one of the older ones. But how did he relate to them? Did any of that come out in the therapy at all? Or?
There's a little bit of talk about his mother. He certainly kind of suffered from her lack of attention and affection. That certainly affected his relationships with women the rest of his life. As far as the rest of his family members, like I said, was very competitive with his brother. There was one instance where they're about 10 years old, and they decided to go around they'd go in opposite directions around the block, and then meet, riding their bikes, and a game of chicken, obviously. And at that point, Jack didn't give away. But Joe was so much bigger, and Jack, they crashed, and Jack had 28 stitches. So that's sort of interesting thing. The rest of his family, he had a very close relationship with his sister Kick. There's a number of books been written about her, and just that they were just sort of partners and being able to joke with each other. So there's no question that he was very close to his sister Kick. Kick was a couple of years younger. Everybody else, he became later on in life, of course, very close with Bobby. But at that point, he was like 7 years older than Bobby, and the age differentiation made it so they weren't really that close. So I don't think he was really that close with anybody else in the family. There was an older sister, Rosemary, and she was the one that had some problems during birth, and so she had some learning disabilities, and she was the one who became lobotomized. So those are the key ones. Competition with his brother, and very close to his sister Kick.
And going back to his friend Lem again, it sounds like he was close with Bobby later on in his one sister, but Lem was he almost like a surrogate brother to him in a way in terms of closeness, do you think?
You could certainly say that. He provided something that his older brother didn't. That's certainly true. Lem was, whatever you want to put it, he sort of gave his life so he could be with Jack. I mean, he was a year older than Jack.
Mm-hmm.
He decided to stay back another year at Choate.
Wow.
So he could be with Jack. It was a lot of money. Lem wasn't that rich. We're unsure of how that happened. Maybe, Jack's father said, "You guys, I'll pay for it," or something. It's hard to say, but, and the same thing happened when Jack was running for a congressional the first time. And, Lem said, "I'll put off going to Harvard Business School so I can, help in the campaign." So here's a guy who was totally devoted to Jack. Like I say, had a room at the White House, and just an incredible relationship.
Very interesting. There's something I was thinking back when you were saying when the Muckers were planning their little, like kids say they're going to do things, they get this big idea, they're going to, high school type of thing in the room, and listening to records, and I there's just this picture of JFK in a room, as a 16-year-old kid, listening to music. So was he a jazz at that time? Was he a jazz person, or kind of the American songbook?
A key song. Let's see, what was the key of the? Oh God, I forgot the name of the song. I even put it in the book there. Anything Goes.
Ah.
So Anything Goes. So it's sort of the swing era.
Right.
So he had his Victrola, which is the original sort of beginning record player. He had in his room, which he actually took to the South Pacific. When he's fighting World War II, he brought the Victrola along.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was something. He loved music. He actually sort of loved to sing. And so that was sort of what brought everybody into the room, all the muckers, and people would wait outside the door. It happened after right before dinner. They would go to JFK and Lem's room and listen to records. And there'd be people outside waiting to get in. So his room and Lem's room became the room to go to. Yeah.
It was pre-Sinatra, but he was prepared to have somebody in the music field to be a good friend at some point, apparently.
One thing that it's interesting to note that none of the, well, I won't say none, but certainly the headmaster, anybody else, they looked at JFK and they said, "This guy is never going to amount to anything." And he was lazy. He got C's, some D's, I think. And the last thing he decided to do, they had these class awards, and he says, "I'm going to show the administration." And so there's all these crazy awards, like a lot of them were like joke awards, like who's the first to get married, or whatever, joke awards like that. But he saw one that he wanted to run for, most likely to be successful. He actually sort of developed a campaign for that, where he got his muckers to trade votes. I'll vote for you for most likely the most happy guy. He wrote for Jack for most likely to succeed. And he beat some very popular kids in school to win the award. So talk about going on from there. So he certainly was.
So that was his first campaign, right?
Campaign, right?
So were any of the students named Nixon? Was this kind of maybe a foreshadowing?
But he could have been there.
Yeah, but that's interesting, that because one would assume, because of all the other things written about Kennedy, he would have been the most popular guy throughout school. And as it turns out, what you're saying is he had to go and show who he was against the most popular people, which is something we don't think about.
Yeah, I mean, there's a popularity contest, certainly, but he campaigned and was very strategic about it. Who would think of trading votes at 17 years old? I wouldn't think about that. So
right, yeah,
credit for that. Yeah.
So he had a very political way, and when his father was very politically motivated, he may have learned things consciously or unconsciously from his dad as well, I imagine. So
Father very much, but his father, was a very influential person in his life, all the way to the presidency. He was always on him to persevere, to win. So that was one thing that the Kennedys had: win at all costs. Second place, that's not for anybody. So he wanted his boys, or even his girls, if you're going to play, make sure and win. So at some point he was screwing around at school, and the headmaster talked with his father, and his father says, "You keep this up, you're going to lose my confidence forever."
Oh.
That's sort of a major thing that I think, so your father says that to you, and that'll make you stop, because you look to your father for guidance. I'm going to lose your confidence forever. So, that was pretty important. Yeah.
Well, when you think of the fact that he has an older brother that he's not meeting up to, and a father, and you kind of have maybe the two most dominant male figures in your life, and you feel they're not exactly on your side, are putting pressure on you, has to put a lot of fear into you in life, to prove yourself.
Well, I just want a couple other things before we're out of time. Want to, talk about, I know you want to ask me what I'm working on.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I would like to know. You mean you're going to do something else beyond this book, are you? Okay.
Yeah, so I'm working on a sequel, and it's just about finished. It takes place right after high school. So he goes on to still a young Kennedy, the part that hasn't been explored. So it takes place right after high school, and various things happen. You wouldn't believe where JFK ends up in the first chapter. I'm not going to tell you. You'll have to read the book. But it follows him through his incredible association with thought to be Nazi spy woman, a woman who, really entranced him. And so it follows him through to PT 109 and then the congressional campaign. So that's what I'm working on now. The working title is, the curious misadventures of young JFK. So it's read about it. It's a more fascinating life for, for 43 years of his life. Well, this is only goes to age 29, but he travels all through Europe, writing his thesis, which turns into a book. So it's his young life was pretty fascinating. So it gets even more interesting, and I hope you'll be.
We had a lot of connections because of his father too. So I imagine that he got the doors open for him going to Europe, and it's pre-World War II. That had to be quite interesting. Did he go immediately from Choate to Harvard? Did he take time off, or did he immediately start?
Father, like he sent his brother Joe to study with this communist professor in England.
Hmm.
So he's there, but of course, what happens again and again and again, he gets sick. So he returns home, and he goes to Princeton, where Lem is, and another friend is. He wants to be with his friends. He's there for about 6 weeks. He gets sick. Same thing. I think he goes to the Mayo Clinic. After he becomes well, he says, Princeton's not the place for me. There's no action there. And then he goes to Harvard and graduates from Harvard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so interesting. But did his brother Joe go to Princeton? Was that another trying to follow his?
The reason he wanted to go to Princeton is, I don't want to go where my brother Joe goes. I want to, keep some distance. It didn't work out at Choate. But then after a couple months at Harvard, where I want to be is Harvard. There's more action there, Harvard Square. And it didn't matter that Joe was there. He sort of overcome, prove himself.
I see. Well, that's great. So that this is leading up, and I like the intrigue that there's spies involved in this, and leading up to the Second World War.
Intrigue, of course. It was just a couple of weeks ago was the anniversary of the assassination. And one thing about my book, we always assassination, and it's sort of dim. We talk about its conspiracies and everything. And my book is about the youth of JFK, the youth.
Right.
A bright spot, and there's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of it's not all easy for JFK, but so sort of staying away from the assassination. But it's the 60th anniversary, and so you can't help but talk about it. And I don't know if I'm in the morning. It's really like 50-50, but I'm of the view that and I've sort of studied it as a lot of people have, but and actually there's sort of some sort of comparison to me. If I look at the character of Oswald and what he did before the assassination, he was this loner. He had never been part of conspiracy. He had no friends. He was a liar. And so he never would have been part of conspiracy, and you see this thread in his personality. And then I look at this person, Trump. And I look at, he always never would admit he ever made any mistake at all. He's always settling out of court, never made a mistake in his life. And so, in 2016, if he had lost, he said, I wasn't going to accept the loss. I would have contested it. So we weren't surprised when 2020, when he contested it and called it rigged. So these two characters, you look at their personality, what they did, and it sort of all adds up. And, what I see is, Oswald is up there. He had a rifle. He'd done a practice run on a general 3 months previous. He just barely missed killing General Walker. He bought this gun. 3 shells were found up there. He had time to do it. And, I think he did it because he wouldn't have been part of any conspiracy. But, that's my view.
Okay. And that's your self-interest. That sounds like another book after the one you've writing right now, right?
Write that one, Bruce, because I'll be done. I'll be moving on to Dick Nixon's young life after this.
Oh, well, I'm sure there'll be a lot of parallels between Nixon and Kennedy in their high school years. Very, very different lifestyles, different backgrounds.
Yeah, right.
Well, thanks, Scott. I mean, I'm really I like the fact that you're following through on this book because we see somebody young like Kennedy And when you finish this book, if you didn't know he was going to be president, I mean, your analogy and your introduction about Holden Caulfield and Catcher in the Rye is there, and you kind of go, maybe we should be thinking. We wish that J.D. Salinger wrote the older version of Holden Caulfield to find out what have happened to him, because maybe those type of things that we think about in our youth that we're embarrassed about come back.
Yeah, one thing we haven't talked about is women. And
Yeah.
talk about JFK, and you have to talk about women. I mean, he had his first girlfriend at Choate, Olive Colley. He wasn't able to complete things with her. She always held out. She ended up being the wife of the IBM president, but he stayed in touch with her the rest of his life, until he died. In terms of just sex, he and Lem made this journey to Harlem to lose their virginity.
Mm.
Very interesting anecdote there. Of course, the interesting part, of course, is that what happened with Lemon there. As we talked about, he is gay, and so he was. Lem was very sort of agonized after he came out. So apparently didn't complete the act, but it was still a big event for both of them. And it's interesting to hear about JFK. Fascination with Hollywood women. Like his father was in the movie business, and JFK visited him when he was young, and all through his life, he was always fascinated with Hollywood celebrities and Hollywood actresses. And there's they go all the way through. Sonia Heine, the skater, was also an actress. Jean Tierney. There was just so many. He was just sort of always after these starlets, just fascinated by that. So never really developed sort of a close relationship with a woman, but the woman he was most infatuated with or most close to was certainly Inga Arvid, so that was a relationship when he went into the service. He was in Washington, and she was an older woman, and she taught him a lot. And he was certainly, it was sort of short-lived, because his father, wanted him to break up with her because, she had interviewed Hitler, and the FBI was watching. They were listening to all their conversations. So,
and this is when he was in Europe. He met her when he was in Europe, or here.
He went into the service as an intelligence officer as he was in Washington, D.C.
Right.
His sister Kik introduced him to her, and they very quickly got together. She was actually a newspaper correspondent, and but she had this background with the Nazis. She was from Denmark, but in order to further her career, she interviewed Hitler, and obviously the government, was getting very close to war and was very worried about this. So they shagged his ass, as JFK said, down to Charleston.
Huh.
And what happened was that Inga came down a couple of times. And stayed at a couple of hotels there. And at some point, things were sort of turning. JFK was starting to realized it was bad for his career, and he was getting ready sort of to be shipped out to the Pacific. So things ended. But even when he came back from the war, he looked her up, and she was just this beautiful, sexy woman. So like I say, even became
So that Muckers mischief was with him for his whole life, essentially. It was always there.
Yeah, when you talk about the personality, JFK was I didn't realize it, was a real risk taker, and that certainly shows true with women. I mean, someone who was involved with the Nazis, you immediately think, well, I'm not going to do it. But he took the risk there. He took risks as a Navy officer, and he took the risks throughout his life with whatever, being with the Marilyn Monroe and a bunch of other women, which could have led to some problems. Even taking all these, meth and all these other drugs was certainly a risk. So you don't think of JFK as this rebellious risk taker, but that was certainly part of his personality.
What do you think? Some of the drugs, he was probably given so many treatments in his youth that taking drugs and trying things was an accepted way that is more, I mean, in some odd way, very accepting, because trusting science to do things back then, possibly.
Yeah, I suppose so. One big thing was when he was getting ready to go to Europe in '39 to do this fact finding for his father, and also research his thesis for Harvard, and he was given one of the earliest steroids by the Mayo Clinic. And they said, we don't know all the side effects of this, but he took a steroid, gave him a lot of energy and everything, but there's some debilitating effects of steroids, and that may have had effect on the degeneration of his, his spine, of his back. And of course, he had incredible problems throughout his life. Think of JFK as president, half the time he's in his, rocker.
Yeah. Yeah, and a young man to be in that situation, yeah, it's very interesting. Going back to the thing with the glamorous life with the women that he knew and dated, and that when he was a student in Choate, of course, being an all-boys school, and you mentioned one young woman that he had a lifelong friendship with, that had to be something that the awkwardness or developing that, because you really have to go out of your way to date and meet somebody, and it was a formal school. I mean, I'm sure there were dances and things like that. Was that something that he enjoyed, did you know, or was he really out to find something? You said he went to Harlem to a bordello, for example, so it's like
lose his virginity. But the way it worked back then is they would import girls from girls' schools, obviously, to come to the dance. They call them tea parties at Choate. And that was sort of how it worked. And actually, how we met Olive Cawley is one of his friends was going to take her to the tea dance, and his friend got sick, and he asked Jack if he could take her. Jack already had another date, but Jack said, okay, so he went to the train station and picked her up, and it sort of went on from there, and they became good friends, and sort of rarity. I mean, the only, I think, gal that he was friends with, going all the way back. So I don't know if they were close friends, but they stayed in touch, and she knew him till till he died. Other things we think about. Sometimes I think about what if JFK had lived, and we do the what if. The one thing that I think about is that to me there wouldn't have been Vietnam. And why do I say that? Part of his, he had been to France when he'd and seen what happened with the French later in life when he was a senator. But I think the biggest thing was that he realized he couldn't trust the military. And the Bay of Pigs happened, which was an event that was already planned in the Eisenhower administration. He just sort of went along with it.
Mm-hmm.
That was this complete failure, right? Except after that, I'll never trust the generals again. So then you have the missiles of October. Of course, the generals wanted, not just the generals, but key members of his cabinet said, "You just go in there and you bomb the hell out of that thing." And he realized, no, I'll never trust the military again. And of course, he came to the solution of the blockade, which maybe saved the world. So comes to Vietnam. My belief, he had already issued an order for 6 months down the line to bring back 1,000 troops. So my point of view, there was never going to be Vietnam, because the generals were going to get him to urge him, of course, to put in 100,000 troops. And Kennedy said, I don't trust the generals, and he wouldn't have done it. So that's the one thing, a big thing we lost. He would only have done it when he won re-election, but to me, there wouldn't have been a Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Guess we won't know.
I guess we won't know. I guess we'll know. We'll never know. But that's certainly something that, I believe. So anyway, yeah. So like I say, I lived out in Boston for a number of years, and I would go to the JFK School of Government there, and there'd be various Kennedys around. I remember seeing JFK Jr. on Martha's Vineyard. One time I wanted to date Robert Kennedy's daughter. So sort of a lifelong interest, if not obsession, with the Kennedys. I mean, it's amazing. Sometimes I think about it, but actually, there's been 40,000 books written about JFK and the Kennedys. 40,000. And every 2 months, I go to the bookstore. There's a new book on some facet of one of the Kennedys, him, and no one seems to ever get tired of it. There's another Netflix thing coming out in another month or so. So people never seem to get tired of the Kennedys.
Mhm.
I don't either.
Yeah. Yeah, you have a lot of opportunity to write more books that way. So you'll have you have an audience.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to move on to Nixon and in his youth. Uh, they were South Pacific and may have crossed paths.
Right, right.
But Nixon was, as you know, we've talked about this great poker player, and JFK was a horrible poker player. It's interesting to sort of think about that because you think he'd be
He had a risk, well, maybe too much of a risk taker.
said,
Maybe too much of a risk taker.
oh, could be. Nixon was sort of sharper in that way, but they're both congressmen, in 1946. And I think about they did one event where they both rode a train up to Pennsylvania to do some sort of event. And I think of that night they spent in a train, you slept overnight in a train, what they talked about. And it's sort of fascinating to think about.
Yeah.
Kennedy and Nixon and what would happen later.
Yeah. That would be a great what if book to write, I would think. The conversations be two senators not knowing what would happen to both of them.
Yeah, they're actually congressmen at this point, but right.
Congressmen, rather.
Yeah.
Hey, it's been really great, Scott. I really appreciate this. The book, I mean, I really enjoyed reading it, and just that insight into a person that you think you know everything about, and also something that I think we could all relate to high school experiences, and that comes across really well in this book. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, just a lot of things surprised me. Just one thing that surprised me is just sort of, when I was a kid, I swore a little bit, not, sort of that much, but just how profane he was.
Mhm.
He loved to write it. Maybe like to write it more than say it, but just how profane he was. You don't think of JFK that way at all, right? This measured, pragmatic, civil person. Of course, he's president, but wow, I couldn't believe, and the one thing that, the incredible amount I did, obviously a lot of research. I was at the JFK library there. I went to Choate several times. But the one thing about JFK, he kept these journals, and there's one reason why there's so many books is that he kept these diaries, and there's these letters that are available to the public, and you really get a sense of what he was like when he's writing to Lem, when he's writing to his sister, writing to his father, writing to his brother. So all these letters are available, and it really gives you insight to his character. So that was, there's
Nixon had a reputation for swearing a lot too, so maybe they had more in common than we realized. So.
right. Yeah, we know as president, he did. I think JFK swore less as president than Nixon did, but in a way, Nixon had a lot more to swear about. Or Watergate, for example. Yeah, I say actually Kissinger died. I didn't realize it, but Kissinger was like an assistant, I don't know, Secretary of State, but he was actually part of the Kennedy administration. I didn't realize it until I saw the obituary.
I didn't realize that either.
Yeah, that was sort of surprising, but yeah.
So I guess maybe Kissinger is the last person of an era that went back, to the mid 20th century. What we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't remember. I never read Kissinger's. Did he write an autobiography? Probably did, huh? Did he talk? Yeah, I don't know.
Well, you've got another book idea coming for right now.
I wouldn't want to write about him, but a pretty interesting character there. But wow, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.